Spain, the end of the Beatles wasn't inevitable. It came through miscommunication, misunderstandings, and missed opportunities to reconcile. This is the story of the great Lost Beatles album. In Like Some Forgotten Dream, Daniel Rachel, winner of the prestigious Pendrin Music Book Prize, looks at what could have been. Here to cast aside all your aspersions or whatever else you may have had about the Beatles and how they split up is Daniel himself. Daniel, good afternoon to you.
Hello, Giles. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, my friend. I thought that we knew everything we possibly needed to know about the Fab Four sort of going down in flames, as it were. Was it Yoko? Was it Paul? Was Paul really alive? Was Ringo looking to branch on himself? Was George establishing himself as more of an independent artist? But in Like Some Forgotten Dream, you look at exactly what happened.
Well, yeah. I mean, the received knowledge, obviously, is that they recorded Abbey Road in the tail end of '69. And then that was kind of it, even though the Let It Be album came out in April 1970 as a recording outfit. They'd finished 6 months before. But it transpired that there were so many songs that they'd worked on in 1969, tail end of '68, and going into 1970, that there was plenty enough that they could have recorded an album. And while that sounds slightly fanciful, the incredible thing is that in September of 1969, just as Abbey Road was coming out, John Lennon proposed to the other Beatles that they should in fact do a new record. And that's really the liftoff point for this book, The Lost Album of the Beatles, that if only, Paul or George, Ringo just said, we're up for it, let's do it. The material was kind of almost written, and there would have been a sensational album in 1970 instead of the solo albums that we've come to know instead.
But if you think about it, that goes against, from a layman's point of view, or somebody who's got a cursory history of the Beatles. It's John who wants to get out of it. He's with Yoko. He's about to form, the Plastic Ono band and all that sort of stuff, and go into experimental. And the perceived wisdom is that John wants out. He's had enough of this all, while the rest of them are quite sort of forging their own paths. John, wants to go and have his time in the States. Wants to basically branch out as an artist on his own, and has almost sort of outgrown the Beatles. Am I completely down the wrong path here, Daniel?
No, I think you're partly right. And all those things that you say have got elements of truth and became realities. But what's interesting is when you start digging into what they were all saying in that last year building up to it, is that they'd all wanted at different times to leave the Beatles and had talked about having a divorce. Paul McCartney in the beginning of '69 says the divorce is coming nearer, and George has made tentative steps to say, look, I want to do a solo record, and he's encouraged by the others to do it. And John very much seems to fluctuate. And this is a recurring theme when you listen and hear all of the Beatles talk, is that John's mind would be changing. Well, I think George says by the hour, let alone by the week or the month. So he has already made Plastic Ono Band records, and he's been doing some solo gigs. But by his own admission, he knows that they don't sell as well as a Beatles record. And he also knows that the strength of what he can do musically is when he's working with the other three Beatles. So I think he's frustrated towards the end of '69 that he's not necessarily getting all of his songs out that he wants to be there on Beatle records. So he comes up with this ingenious idea where he says to Paul, this is how we do it. We'll do a new record. I'll have 4 songs. You have 4 songs. George can have 4 songs. And if Ringo wants them, he can have 2. And that's what he proposes.
That's really interesting for a couple of reasons. One of them is the fact that they recognise that George Harrison is a great songwriter, because George has been coming on quietly in the background doing his own thing, basically you could say since Revolver, and and is far more avant-garde than a lot of the stuff which is confrontational from John. And Paul's putting together these beautiful, perfect pop songs at the time. And as for Ringo, well, I think he's just happy to be there, playing the drums. But that is that says that recognizes that they are all of equal parts, doesn't it?
No, absolutely. I mean, George's songwriting part is, as you suggest, extraordinary. But come the end of the touring years, and each year he writes more songs, and the quality of them is quite extraordinary. And so by the time you get to kind of 69, he's got this whole wealth of songs, of which many of them will appear on his first solo album, which, as you know, is a triple album. So he's piling them up. But more importantly is the quality of those songs. I mean, they're really, really fabulous songs. And, and the Beatles do that with Something is the great one of 69, of course. And George will prove himself, and who he's been living cheek by jowl with the greatest songwriters of all time in popular music, Lennon and McCartney, and it's rubbed off on him in an extraordinary way. Who would have thought? And it's so, and it's a lovely thing that John recognizes that. And he knows that there's a rancor in George that he potentially is not going to be realized for who he is beyond the guitar player, and he wants him to be part of it. And that journey means let's have equal status, and that's John on obviously in a great mood, good days ahead.
And that's interesting as well, because it paints John as conciliatory, because again the perceived wisdom is he marries Yoko, and then by 69 he's done. He wants to go off and do his own thing. And when you look at the album that comes out, Ram, for example, which takes the complete Mick, the album cover of McCartney's Lamb album. I think that's his first album, isn't it? Since when he goes solo, and you think, well, Ram's
the second one, yeah. There's the self-titled McCartney album.
Yeah, but it completely, that completely drives a wedge, doesn't it? And then that's kind of done for 1971 onwards, kind of thing. So we're looking at.
I'm more skeptical about Charles, about the idea of a wedge between them, because as you can see when we saw the fantastic Get Back film, this historically is meant to be a period where they're really at each other, that they're arguing all the time, that creativity has reached a low, and it's clearly not the case. And when I wrote Lost Album of the Beatles, I was privy to hearing over 100 hours of audio tape from those sessions, and my conclusion was that this was a creative force very much at its zenith. You consider what they've done in the preceding years, whether it's the White Album or Revolver or Sgt. Pepper. These are incredible heights to surpass, and yet they still are with their creativity, and they look really strong. And as in the interviews that I've read and listened to and watched of this last year of the Beatles, creatively they talk about being a force, and of course they prove that when they do the Abbey Road album, which is collaboratively arguably I would say one of the greatest achievements of the Beatles. So in the studio they're together as a four-piece, as four people. Where the problem lies is the business end of things, with what's happening with the new business manager Alan Klein. Obviously there's the influence of them getting into their 30s, getting married, finding long-term relationships. It's encroaching upon how they used to interact as individuals. But the argument I really go for in the book is that they have this almost wonderful but strange ability to put anything between them in a business sense to one side when they go into a studio and when they record, so that when Abbey Road's coming out and John wants to do a new album, it makes perfect sense.
And I think that's one of the things that, when we saw the documentary, all the hours of documentary film came out, was the fact that they were creating, they were working. It wasn't a sort of like late 70s spat. Oh, I'm going to come down in my private jet, do my session, and then get out of the studio surrounded by hangers on. It was just them together, literally working out songs. I mean, the writing of Get Back, which literally comes out of, again, 3 chords in the studio, and you see it happen and you go, good grief, this is how it happened.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is one of the most extraordinary pieces of footage I've ever seen in my life. There's Paul just hammering on his bass, my feeling is that the rhythm of that, and then what Ringo plays on the drums, comes from the way they've been approaching the song the two of us, which has got that kind of rhythm, and it kind of seeps into Get Back, and then Two of Us becomes more of an acoustic version. But yeah, to see that. But likewise, you take All Things Must Pass, George Harrison's song, and there's a hint of it in the Peter Jackson film. But when you listen to all the tapes, they worked on that song for many days, over many hours. And the collaborative effort is quite extraordinary. There's a verse where Paul tries singing a counter kind of chorus line over George's verse melody. And then in the chorus, you hear George, Paul, and John harmonizing 3-part, as they did way back on This Boy. And once you've heard that, it's so difficult to go back to the solo version, knowing there was a version that the Beatles had done, and when you start imagining then songs like Jealous Guy, or The Backseat of My Car, it's songs that we know as solo records, but by the Beatles. But equally, we have outtakes of the Beatles doing them as a band. It really plays with your mind, and so leads this fantasy idea of an album.
How did you get your hands on then these recordings? And they're not presumed in the general release, are they? So how did you track these?
No, Giles,
is that a state secret, Daniel?
It's state secret. I'd have to, if I revealed my source, I'd have to kill you.
Oh well, it's not the first time.
It's like Mission Impossible.
And is it like akin to finding the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you listen to them and you go, because if you're of a certain age, you grew up you didn't have nursery rhymes if you were a kid in the 60s and 70s. It was the Beatles songs. It's akin to finding it's akin. That's why Elvis Costello, the greatest thing that came out on Live Aid was when Elvis Costello got up and said, "I'm going to sing you a Northern folk song," and then sang "All You Need Is Love." He got it in one. And so those are our folk songs, and the Beatles it's like finding the original annotation of an ancient folk song. It's like the Dead Sea Scrolls, Daniel.
No, I agree with you entirely. I mean, I say in the introduction to the book that being a Beatle fan is more akin to being part of a cultural blood group. There's something really special about it, and in the same way as if a Shakespeare play had suddenly revealed itself, or all the after 400 years, or all his workings out in draft versions. This is what it's like. This is the importance of finding Beatles stuff, and I think listening to those tapes, as I'm sure listeners will agree when they watch the Peter Jackson documentary, you feel as if you have been placed in Twickenham, in Apple, in the middle of the rehearsal process of the greatest band that's ever existed. And to just sit there with all 4 Beatles in both ears, coming up with ideas, having long conversations, trying out this, that, and the other. It's an extraordinarily moving experience. And it's the nearest thing that I've ever come to understanding what it would have been like to be a member of the Beatles, beyond anything I've ever previously read or watched or heard. Those tapes just plant you minute by minute through each day of over a month of recording and rehearsing.
But isn't that then like having, it is like, well, you say that like some forgotten dream. It's like that the dream where you wake up and you think you imagine you have a huge pile of money or whatever your heart's desire next to you, and then you wake up and it's so vivid that you can almost taste it or touch it or whatever. And then you wake up and in the words of it was just a dream. And so for you to hear those, all things must pass with a three part harmony, mind officially blown, then therefore it must be, because it's you're close enough to taste it, and you can see how that final album, that one more album, could have been, because obviously Let It Be is recorded before Abbey Road, really, but it's chronologically it's after Abbey Road, so it doesn't complete, and it would be the one to complete the cycle.
No, that's it. And there's so many illustrations. I mean, one of the great ones is hearing "Give Me Some Truth," which will be officially released on John's second solo album. Really fantastic lyrical. John really at the height of his lyrical powers, a great melody, driving rhythm. But this was a song that he'd rehearsed with Paul. And you can hear there are extracts of those rehearsals, and Paul taking lead vocals on the bridge. And they've obviously worked on it in rehearsal. Then they're rehearsing. They briefly come back to it in '69, and so by rights it was a Beatles song. And then there's illustrations of Every Night or Junk, where John's singing with Paul, and these examples of each of them playing on each other's songs and each other's records and developing the idea, then goes into that idea of saying, well, what is it about these four musicians that offer something to each other that they weren't really able to replicate on every song when they went solo? And I think that's one of the hardest things to understand, really, or get your head around when you come up with the idea of the Great Lost Album, is that you'll forever have the arrangements that you'll always hear the Jealous Guy version, or maybe I'm Amazed version, but what I'm suggesting is strip that song back to its essence, melody and words. And what would have happened if Paul McCartney had played bass on Give Me Some Truth, or George Harrison had played lead guitar on the backseat of my car, or My Sweet Lord had been done with Ringo on drums? I mean, and the creative force that the Beatles were together, that kind of chemistry they had for arrangement. And ultimately, I think more than anything is Paul McCartney's genius at arranging. Beyond, he's beyond maybe say Stevie Wonder. Is there anybody that he's peerless, isn't he?
I mean, pretty much so. You don't get much in terms of that. I mean, Nile Rodgers perhaps, but that's a different age. But in terms of the actual arrangements, absolutely not. And it's proof as well, isn't it? Because they're all playing off each other, and so they all keep each other in check. But they all, like a beautiful banquet. Each course complements each other. And when the Beatles go, then there is nobody to either rein in or push forward, or say you're overindulging yourself, or to say, strip it back, or let's go in this direction.
One of the most amazing pieces of audio I heard was when they were rehearsing Don't Let Me Down. And John brought the song to rehearsals as a very kind of simplistic 2-chord song with a very kind of bluesy, moving melody. And what you realize is, over the course of the hours and the different days of rehearsal, is that Paul sings back the song to John, and they keep on singing backwards and forwards to each other, and without really speaking very much, they influence one another and so Paul's natural bent for adding melodic turns and little runs influences then the way that John sings it back. And while this is happening, George can be heard working out melodies, and before you know it, he's coming up with the fantastic guitar line that will be the middle eight of that song. And so had John done that song a year later, all those arrangement ideas would not have existed, and it would have been an entirely different song. I'm sure equally as good, but in a very different way. But you can never underestimate the power and chemistry of 4 people that have formed the band and can write songs, and nothing can replace that. And it's not just the Beatles; all bands know that as a story. But the Beatles have a magic that surpasses any other guitar four-piece, I would say.
I know it's going to be churlish, and feel free to shoot me down with a very large ACAC gun. But you would mention "Don't Let Me Down," but Billy Preston as well. And I know he's not the original. I know he's not a member of the Fab Four from back in the day. But there is an influence in that later work as well. Now, I'm not saying that he should have been on that album, but it is interesting to what he brought to those later sessions as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's so joyous when Billy Preston arrives at Apple, and the joy that the Beatles get from his arrival and playing with somebody they know from their days in Hamburg. And this is a guy that can just put his, like Ringo says, here's a man that when he puts his fingers on the keyboard never plays the wrong note, and he said, I've known him for 30 years or whatever the quote is, but he has quite an incredible influence on the band. But at the point where, prior to that, John has been sitting at the keyboard quite a lot and has been trying to release ideas, but there's a certain limitation that's not allowing him to express what he mostly wants to do. And Billy brings that to that. And had the Beatles gone on to record in late 69, early 70, I'm sure he would have been a part of it.
And let's have a reappraisal as well, though it's a bit of a hackneyed thing, because Ringo is a great drummer. There's always that line, from 1960, whenever it is. But it's a joke, because if you listen, the more and more I listen to the Beatles stuff, the more I realize is less is more. And the more I realize that, Ringo is a superb drummer and sets his kit up in such a way that a very few. It's the trick, isn't it? Making it look easy is the most difficult trick it is of a tool.
Yeah, and I mean that idea. I mean that the Ringo can be dismissed as a drummer. I've just got scant time for that kind of opinion. Most people that talk about that aren't musicians or don't appreciate what drummers do. I mean, he is an extraordinary drummer because of his inventiveness and imagination. And I think that's what marks out most great musicians is imagination. Because when you're confronted with a song, you've got to decide what to play, what not to play, what to add to it, what works, what doesn't work. And it's those choices that you go back to something like In My Life. And I think Ringo's decision, was to play an open hi-hat on the verse. It's virtually nothing, but you listen to that song and it's driving it and adding this kind of wonderful percussive idea. And then you listen to Rain and the kind of the thunderous drums on that, and the use of the toms was so inventive and influential on one of generations of bands to come, and A Day in the Life or Hello Goodbye, the drumming on all of that. And then, he has the most successful singles solo career for the first couple of years or so, and it was really what, with this book, what I ended up realizing was that the only way that the arguments that between the four of them as to equal time would be to create an album called Four Sides of the Beatles, where each Beatle is allowed to have one side of vinyl. And so in doing this, Four Sides of the Beatles, coming up with the 6 songs on Ringo's side of the record was a lot of fun. And you realize that he has this charm in singing as well, that we all know, Octopus's Garden, Yellow Submarine, that kind of thing, that carried on in his solo years. And so you get things like It Don't Come Easy, that people may know that George Harrison wrote, and or even early 1970. There were so many possibilities for Ringo's records. It was a really fun part of the book to write.
So when it comes to a track list, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, and I've been doodling and mucking around whilst I'm doing this interview, and I'm thinking, right, three off the top of my head, right? My Sweet Lord, obviously, because you've said that's coming in already. Yeah, Jealous Guy, you've said that because, again, a lot of people, the first time they heard that was the Roxy Music version. Great though it was, but it was the 80s. Yeah. Working Class Hero, presumably, was that coming later?
It's a contender.
Yeah,
you could definitely have it.
I think you could maybe bring that back as a blues song rather than being an angry protest. Because, like I said, John, there was a rawness that came out, wasn't there? Which now that we know more about Lennon and his back, but there was I would have said that would be, you could have done. I'm not saying put the Long and Winding Road strings on it, but it could be interesting. What else was in there?
Well, I mean, there's well, give you a couple that you haven't maybe. Well, there's "What Is Life." That would have been a George song. "Another Day," Paul McCartney. "Instant Karma."
Yeah, of course.
I God, and you could have a Beatles record finishing with John's crushing words, "I don't believe in Beatles." That could have been a
Ooh.
fascinating way
Oh.
to end the record.
Rather than Her Majesty's
What
a
I
really nice
decided
girl, and someday I'm going to make her mine, oh mine. Yeah, I suppose that's a hell of a way to sign off, isn't it? Yeah.
But what I decided to do was that, because I'm aware that this idea of the lost album, the fantasy record that could have been, has become. I used to play this as a game when I was a teenager with my best friend, and we used to spend hours just arguing people amongst ourselves, people down the pub. I've obviously matured in those decades since then, but I've realized that the idea of it's never gone away. And when I decided to create it as a book, obviously I went online and I was shocked that worldwide so many people have talked about it and come up with their ideas and their theories. And what I realized was that it needed some kind of parameters to make it legitimate, because although it's a fantasy, everything that you read in the book, the interviews, the information, they are fact. So everything is genuine. It's fantasy, but everything is based in fact. And so what I did was set parameters. So I don't have anything in the book written after the end of 1970, when Paul decided to take the Beatles to court to sue them. So it has to have been written while the Beatles were together, or just in the post few months after the split. But what you find is that 3/4 of the record, those songs were in rehearsal already.
Wow. Just fascinating. Just fascinating. The book is called Like Some Forgotten Dream. What do you think? What did you call your last Beatles album then, Daniel? Have you come up with a title for it?
Well, you're saying the hardback version, Giles. The paperback, which is now just coming out, is the Lost Album of the Beatles. They've retitled
it. Right.
And then, so Lost Album of the Beatles. But then within the book, I call the record, the imaginary record, Four Sides of the Beatles.
Makes perfect sense. I just like that idea of what's the thing that John says at the end? What do you think to say?
I don't believe in Beatles.
I don't believe in Beatles. Yeah, absolutely brilliant.
And crucially, not the Beatles.
No, exactly. Daniel, if people want to find you online, do you have a presence? Where can people track you down and argue with you to the heart's content, saying, no, what we needed was an 8, is 5 sides of Octopus's Garden with a full orchestra.
No, and absolutely, I really want people to argue, and I've written that in the introduction of the book. This is, you're never going to appease Beatle fans, and the point is, it's a parlor game. It's a bit of fun, but it's also taking a serious look at how they were as 4 people in '69. So arguments are great. That's what it's about. It's about having a joyous debate about a great band that we all love and songs that we love. I'm all across social media. You can find, you just look up Daniel Rachel and there's a website, and then I'm on all social platforms. So find me on all the different ways, and then the book is in all the different places that you'd expect. And
you'll be able to order it as a virtual download from our own virtual bookstore too. The book is called, so the paperback is called, is it The Lost Beatles Album then?
The Lost Album of the Beatles.
The Lost Album of the Beatles. It's by Daniel Rachel, who talked to today. Daniel, my little grey matter is spinning now in terms of potential playlists, arrangements, etc. But it's been absolutely brilliant to speak to you. Go find Daniel on all the social medias. Daniel Rachel, thank you so much for your time today.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me, Giles.